Matt and I are lucky today to have Ade with us, who is a good friend of both of ours and one of the people that I learn most from, and is especially famous because he's the person who introduced me to Claudebot. Um, Welcome to the show, Ade. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. Although, also see you again. Although I will point out, I personally don't use Claudebot or Maltbot or OpenClaw. I'm too scared.
I have not been willing to take the plunge either, but it seems like people are having a lot of fun with it.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of personal agents. I've built several, but none of them have been any good.
What I've been doing,
It's
which I feel like is like one step beneath it, is I will have these like local repos, like again on my personal computer, where I will be like, oh, I'm gonna find the API key for this particular thing and let Claude Code go and write. But I feel like that's more constrained. There's no skills, like, and I know what service I'm potentially giving up by doing that. Um, but yeah, Claudebot OpenClaw has I've not been willing to take the plunge quite yet.
I haven't used it. It's definitely interesting. I don't, the security stuff doesn't worry me as much because there's various ways to sandbox things, but I guess what I struggle more with is like the things I'm using like Claude Code or Codex, they're already quite agentic. They can go for like 10 minutes. And so when often, longer. And so when I see people are, saying, oh, I ran this thing for 4 hours or overnight, I'm like, what like input did you give it? How much
Mm.
upfront? And so I think for me, I'm often thinking about not just like the output. I mean, clearly these things can output a ton of code, but like almost like what's the input to output ratio a little bit? And there are certain tasks. I can imagine more like back-endy tasks. I remember like when I was at Dropbox, the desktop clean team had this project that was like upgrade, from Python 2.6 to Python 2.7. It's like the spec for that's like quite small of like the intent, and there's a whole suite of like validation tooling. I can imagine that thing running like overnight for like a long time, and it kind of comes back in the morning, it's done. But like most of what I'm doing requires me to kind of constantly explain more about what my intent is, check in early so I can course correct, give feedback. And so I just personally am not yet at a limit. Like since I'm the limiting factor, typically I don't really want to run 12-hour jobs because I'll come back and I'll be like, whoa, like what happened here? How do I review all of this?
I'm curious that you're using the length of the autonomy as the main metric, not the utility of the thing you ask it to do. So if you
Yeah,
ask it,
I don't
I
think
don't
it's a
know,
good metric. Yeah, I agree. I mean,
yeah,
length is not a good metric, I don't think.
yeah, because you could ask it something like, "Hey, analyze this contract," and if you get a good result in 30 seconds, that's better than if you get a good result in 3 hours.
Yeah, I mean, the other dimension, I guess, for me is like what happens at the end. So at least for like coding, I think the bottlenecks for me is basically upfront. Can I explain clearly enough what I want, and then can I test and verify sort of the output and have confidence that I should merge it? And so those are sort of the ones where I have to be like a little bit more. I don't want. I typically don't want it to go off for a long time and then just like dump a bunch of code on me. But there's other tasks like research tasks that, if it's just like, hey, go and explore something, read the web, but read my code base, come back, and I sort of don't intend it to like turn into code yet. Those are sort of easier to just sort of like let go for a while, maybe kick off 3 or 4, read them. I'm going to archive them all anyway. But it's kind of the coding ones where I'm like, don't go too far before I want to see some code before you go, too wild. But that's kind of my workflow. I'm sure it's kind of different for everybody.
Well,
I
I
mean, it
had
depends on
something
what you're trying.
new this week where and actually this was with Sawyer Dev, which Ade I also discovered because of you, where I have an app that I'm working on and it needs a search feature. I could tell that the kind of the naive implementation of the search feature was not quite what I wanted it to be, and so I told Claude Code, okay, here's search. I want you to run 5 or 6 different searches, and then keep a friction log and tell me how you think it could be better. And it came back. So I got out of that, I got a .md file with 15 reasonably spec'd, reasonably organized, and feature improvements that I then turned around and said, okay, like go and I want you to do 1, 3, 7, and 8. The other ones I don't think matter for my use case. And it was incredibly high leverage because I have some users and I'm going to be showing you this next week. And search went from being like there and very embarrassing to like I'm sure that a 90th percentile user will find something that's missing or not quite right to like it's good enough, right? And I got to do all of that while focusing on something that I couldn't explain, if that makes sense.
What is Sawyer Dev for those of us like me that don't know?
Ade, you told me. Do you use it?
I've there's so many things I do not remember what Sawyer Dev is anymore.
James, you have to
So
tell us what it is.
yeah. So Sawyer Dev is an MCP server that now I can't find on Google. But basically what it does is it lets Claude open up the Chrome, like a Chrome instance or some
Oh,
sort of
okay. I know what
sandbox.
you mean now. Okay, sorry. You were saying soya, and I was thinking like in like soy sauce, but you mean soya, Sawyer.
Yeah, like Tom
Yeah.
Sawyer. Yeah, and
Yes.
Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a man's name. Basically, it's a kind of a better playwright. If you know
Mm,
playwright, it's
hmm
basically that but better. Uses fewer tokens, works more reliably.
mm.
And it'll
Okay, so
spin over in the background. So the Chrome comes up, it does a search, it gets a result, it takes a screenshot. And it does this.
mm,
What I've started to do now is tell Claude to think in advance of like 5 different user personas and 5 different stories, and then go and do what they would do. And it just runs over in the side, and then I have it do the output as a .md file, so there's no risk. I'm not getting a ton of changes dumped on me, but I think it's really useful for like product hardening and product polish and um,
hmm,
I found two or three things that I wouldn't have otherwise
nice.
found.
And you're running this on your like local host on a port, or this is using like it's just running locally on your machine, basically, right?
It's running locally on my machine.
Okay.
Chrome has some sort of sandbox, and they have some restriction where only one of these can be running at a time, which I hate. They also won't let me log in as myself using my like Google account. I'm sure for some protection reason, but I want to be able to give the agent a user account and let the user like run. So I've had to kind of like hack my way through that.
Hmm.
Um,
Cool. I'll check it out.
but really useful.
It's pretty cool. I mean, one thing you kind of stumble on a little bit is that how do you tell the agent what to build? Because the easy way is to hand wave, hey, go build me search. Whereas you could also say, hey, I want full text search, or I want semantic search, or I want search, but I want to use these algorithms and combine them in this way and use this ranking thing and use this boosting and this stemming and da 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 da. How do you decide?
I mean, in this particular case, what got me to try this was that I am building a AI tool that takes a city's zoning code and brings AI chat into it. And the product that I'm replacing has a search feature, and that search feature is free. And so my hypothesis is that if the cities that I'm working with are going to adopt this with the AI chat version, they're not going to be able to lose a feature that they already have. Um, and even if I don't think that's the most important thing, I still want it to work reasonably well. And so I added a search bar, and the search on the existing site is like functional. And actually what I've noticed that I can do with this tool is I can actually point it and get it to compare my search versus the search that's live today and get like some sense of like ranking and like, am I outperforming? Am I underperforming? All three of us have a little bit of search life experience that I can bring to that. But I haven't been too prescriptive because I just don't think this is the core of the thing that I'm building. What I've tried next, and I won't know the results until later today when I have a chance to check in, but is actually having it run some of the actual AI chats. So come in with some user persona. Imagine you're a developer and you have this sort of a question, run through and then take screenshots. And I'm expecting I'm actually going to find a lot of UI polish stuff in there because I can I have seen some of that in my own testing, and that's much more core. And so I'll be much more opinionated about what I allow it to put in and not to put in, and how I allow it to make changes. But I do think we talked a couple of shows ago about the bottleneck used to be coding. Now the bottleneck is what do I build? How do I verify? And this is like by far one of my best tools for that.
I've changed quite a bit. I've started to kind of move away from specs, which surprises me a little bit. I got pretty spec pilled for a while, and I certainly still do write. I mean, I don't know quite the definition of a spec. I still write quite a few markdown files. Some of them are kind of evergreen documentation. Some of them are project docs. Like I still do that, but I almost I don't know if I've talked to you, James, about my kind of like diverge converge workflow. I haven't really written much about this, but I've been sort of moving. I almost feel like it's premature for me to just jump in and write a spec. Like I'm not smart enough to just like even with Claude, like write the markdown doc. So I can show you a little vignette of what I'm doing. Let me see if this works. But I was just doing this before the call, actually. I don't know if I'll show you that one, but I'll show you an example. I mean, one thing that's sort of weird, can you guys see my screen here?
Yep.
One thing that's just I still find surprising is just like the idea that software is cheap. I'm still recalibrating my brain on that. I spent much of my career as a PM, sort of I assumed like, engineering is expensive and kind of say no to things, protecting it. But I often find it's like faster to just explore in like software now than in Figma or in Google Slides. And so this is a little like space that's just gated to me. It's like I mean it's in our app, but it's like it's just only I can see this, and it's a little internal concept place where I'll have Claude Code or Codex like kind of work on concepts. I'll just show you an example. Like I mean, the product we're building, basically, we're trying to kind of like create this whole UI environment that, knows your design system and your component library, your styling, all these things. And so I was trying to kind of figure out, how do we want to represent this? And so almost before I would write a spec or figure out what this is, I just have like Claude or Codex act like a designer and go through and do like a whole divergent exploration. Like, do we want, a hover card here? I don't know. Do we want, do we want sort of a full screen picker? Do we want more one of these guys? And so I just tend to go through these often, and I'll usually do one that's kind of divergent. This was a thing where I was like, okay, AI products, there's a lot of weighting involved. Can I do something just like a little bit different there? And I was like, oh right, Claude knows how to animate icons. I don't know how to do that. So we were kind of exploring, some ideas here, or like an overlay. And some of these are bad. It's like I was like, hey, try a bunch of things. I'm like, okay, like, but just almost this idea that like it knows Framer motion. It can create little like vignettes with fake data where I'm like, nah, I don't like these, don't like these. And then eventually I'm kind of like starting to converge and like, I think, okay, we landed somewhere here. And then once I've sort of got this is actually much more interesting to me than a spec because it's already encoded a lot of the constraints and sort of decisions. And once I kind of have a thing I can play with and like, oh, yeah, I like this. Okay, now we can go to, this is all throwaway, basically. I'm going to just like archive all of this code. But I can like take this and say, okay, now I want to go and make a component that we can start to put in our app. So I've been sort of going through these sort of like, I tell it like I want to diverge. Don't, let's not pin down. Give me 10 different things. And sometimes I'm surprised it comes up with ideas like, I wouldn't have thought of that. And then I'll sort of start telling it, I like this one, I like that. We start to converge a bit. Then we do a polish pass. But I've been finding that kind of, I think good designers do this kind of process, but kind of having it lead me through this, that's been a really kind of almost like an alternative to me sitting and writing like a spec where I'm like, I don't know what I want yet,
So one thing I'm surprised by is that you're looking at just things and things that are in the model's training data. What I find has been really interesting, so I'm doing the Space Invaders game, and one of the things I've been able to do is to say, go search the web. Get me the history of Space Invaders and like all the different versions of it that have been made over the last 40 years. What do they have in common? What do the ones that succeed look like? Tell me about the variants, Galaga, Galaxians. Bringing all of that stuff, and now show me some options for what we can do. And I get a much richer set of examples that way.
Totally. I mean, typically I'm using either other Claude Code or Codex, and what I like is it can search my code base, which gives it a lot of context. But then it can also it'll do web search as well. Sometimes it's like documentation, but like I mean things like you're talking about. It's just I used to use like Claude Chat more, and I was kind of more of a copy paste guy. But like there's something about just it can see my code base. I'm like, okay, you're gonna get up to speed so much faster. I have a whole mono repo. I've got readmes, so like kind of being there in the code base. But then go search the web if you need more information. It's also kind of quite powerful.
I mean, for my projects, I end up with a specs folder and a research folder because there's lots of things where I don't know enough about the space to have good opinions. So like one of the things I was doing is a music synthesizer, step synthesizer, and the problem is I'm not musical. And so I made the first version, and every time I showed it to anybody who's musical, they would ask obvious questions, and I would say, I don't know what those words mean.
Yeah.
Because they would ask me a musical question, I'd say, oh, I should have that feature? What is arpeggio? And I realized that they were going to have to try and give me 10 years of their musical training, or I was going to go have Claude go research this space for me, and then have it educate me, and then I could make decisions.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
What made you want to do the Space Invaders game?
It was a bad joke at a meetup. So somebody from Claude made some reference about how the Claude CLI is basically a game engine. And I haven't made a game since the 80s. And me and somebody from a couple of colleagues, including one of them who works at OpenTUI, we're talking about, well, TUIs are really kind of like, our game engines, really. Why don't more people make games? And then I was thinking, that's not a great idea, but how hard would that be? And so I pulled out my phone and I just started starting to spec it out a little bit.
Yeah.
Just sort of pulling some ideas. And I just did this while we were just standing there in the coffee shop. And then it kind of, I got carried away.
Waiting in lines has really changed because I got stuck at the post office this week. The person that was supposed to work the counter called in sick, and so they had no one there. But I had to mail it that day. Like it had to be stamped that morning. So I had to wait for 30 minutes while somebody drove from another place. And I've got the Claude mobile app. I've got Claude Code up, and I'm just like, at that point in time, it's all upside. It's feature ideas. It's, and not a lot of it was useless, right? But a couple of like really cool things came from it because I just had this like downtime where no one could interrupt me, and I had to just go.
Yeah.
One thing I was kind of been thinking about some this morning, sort of similar to this, is just like the just like developer workflows are in a lot of flux right now. Like you're figuring out how to do things on your phone, right? And it's like I think in a way, like workflows are always in flux, but there's kind of this like bundling and unbundling of workflows that's kind of constantly happening. And when I think about it for myself, like what do I, if you sort of stood and looked over my shoulder, like what are the sort of tools I need to code? Well, I have a voice thing. I use WhisperFlow for that. I'm going to need a model. Like I have a couple of preferences there. I'm going to need a harness. Sometimes the model and harness are integrated, like the Claude Code with an Anthropic model, Codex with an OpenAI model, or you can use OpenCode or Cursor with some other model. I need a Git thing. Some people like that in their IDE, some like it in their terminal. I still need an IDE. Some people maybe have given up on that, but you could I have a terminal in my IDE. You could also have an IDE in your terminal. How does that work? And then as you start to get into doing things in parallel, then I need like an orchestrator. So, I'm using Conductor, but I was trying out the Augment Code has a new intent thing this morning. I was like, okay, everyone's sort of trying to figure out like, how do we sort of bundle or unbundle different parts of the workflow, which I think is just at an individual level interesting. Like I still, certain part, like I don't really want like the voice thing in an app. I like to have my voice thing separate because it works across all my apps. But each of these things also has a voice thing. So everyone's kind of trying to like have like they're part of the workflow and kind of like extend in either way. But then sometimes it's just like curious. Like it's a lot of what we're talking about here about sort of dev workflows are sort of in this spirit of like what things go together, what things are we kind of combining.
I think one of the other aspects is that you can look at things we've tried in the past that didn't work and then say, well, how expensive is this now? So one of my favorite things is property-based testing, which used to be fairly esoteric. Basically being able to say, I have a bit of code. So for instance, in a game system, when player ship shoots, bullet hits this thing. Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff around collision detection, around the irregular shapes, and there's lots of complicated maths. And you get bugs, and you go, oh, damn. If I stand just behind a barrier, just like this, the bullet misses me always. And it's like, oh, there's some bug in the way, the shape of the ship, the shape of the barrier, the shape of the bullet interact. And ordinarily, you've just spent ages adding more and more tests for more and more scenarios. Nowadays, you can just say, download a property-based testing system, which will look at all the inputs to this function, and then say, well, max int, min int, 0, -1, +1, and check all the combinations. And it will basically try all the combinations and then minify it down to what is the smallest set of tests that exercise the entire thing. And you don't have to do anything other than say, here's what this function looks like. Go. And so you end up with something that mathematically is correct, but without you have to do the hard work you would have had to do in the past.
It is a good thought experiment off to think about something that was previously expensive become cheap. What happens? So, like storage gets cheap, you get Snowflake, or, bandwidth gets cheap. Okay, you get YouTube, and then, TikTok. I think kind of in developer land, one of the, I'm sort of like obsessed with compilers. I probably bring it up too often, but just like compilers is sort of one way that we sort of move up the ladder and we get more leverage. But it's like very hard to write a compiler, previously, and it took a while. But like, right, I was sort of working in BI for a couple of years, despite my best efforts not to build a BI tool. Like Looker was like quite an interesting tool where they came up with this modeling language that sort of let someone create this kind of data world and guardrails. But it was like pretty hard to write LookML. You had to find somebody that was like it wasn't quite imperative code, but it was like code-ish, and they also had to care about the business, that you needed like a certain persona that could do that. But today, if you're building Looker, like, LookML is still a good idea, but like AI can actually help write it if there's a good spec for that. And so you could sort of focus at a higher level of like, I kind of think of like, we don't have a good word for it. I call it source code, but it's like a source code above the source code. That like maybe it's like like intent code or something, like something where I could, it's still like kind of structured English. It's like, you try to avoid ambiguity, but if I can explain my intent, LLMs are kind of these universal compilers now that can compile to sort of whatever compile target you want if there's enough sort of detail about what that target is. So
There's a hack here. So in the olden days, we used to have telephones, and then we got car phones and things. And then we got mobile phones, and then what eventually happened is now we have phones, and then we have landlines. So in the same way you have all this vibe coding, there is a chance that we'll get to a world where it'll be coding and then hand coding.
Oh, handcrafted code is 100% going to be a thing.
Artisanal.
100% going to be. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, my favorite. This is not directly related to coding, but my favorite thing is when you go to an ancient site. Like I noticed this at Angkor Wat, and they'll sit there and be like, every single one of these carvings is different, as if that meant that the people who carved it were doing something special in order to make all of them different. But that would have been completely to the people who made it. It'd be like, of course they're all different. It's only we who live in a manufactured age that expect the uniformity of things. And yeah, anyway, artisanal coding, 100% gonna be a thing. There's gonna be people who do this performatively. And I'm sure they'll be really successful, and they should be.
I'm not sure. I think there's more than just performative. So I wrote a book about software craftsmanship, so I'm biased, but we used to have handcrafted code, crafting, and then we try to claim we had software engineering. But what we're getting now is more like a factory, where there's a factory I can basically throw my ideas in and it'll just crank and generate code. But it's usually worse than if I had done it myself. And I look at the code and I go, yeah, this kind of works, but if I were doing this, I wouldn't do it like that. And then I realized it's the same way if you order food from a takeout restaurant. If you're a good cook, I'm not, you'd look at it and you'd say, it's not really what I would do, but it was quick and it was cheap. So now you've got your software factories, you've got your people doing performative craft, but you also have people who you go to because they're the equivalent of a Michelin-star restaurant. They're going to make something so good, the machine couldn't hit the same quality level, at least not now. So you're going to get
I feel like
the
this is
SQLite guys.
I feel like this is like a sort of a tension or a theme sort of throughout the history of technology that you're sort of talking about, that if if you go back through computing back to the punch cards and you keep tracing that back to where the punch cards came from, they came from like the Jacquard loom, where they were sort of trying to automate, the mechanical loom in like the Industrial Revolution in France and England. And, the original Luddites, they were basically like, they were sort of like artisanal, craftspeople who were making textiles, and they were sort of like, they had some good points about sort of the economic, like who was going to benefit from this kind of transition. But on the other side, you had, if you look at how much did people spend on their clothing in those days as a percentage of their income, it was like quite high. And so, my sister, she kind of is closer to, she's always sort of enjoyed sewing and pattern making different things. And so, you'd say like fast fashion, and it's like sort of very cheap. It's very, you're cutting a lot of corners. It's kind of this big factory operation, but it's also sort of cheap. As you have these, but some people will say, oh, but I still actually, I'd like to pay more to have somebody who is more of like a craftsperson. So yeah, I think it's a kind of not a new theme exactly, but sort of taking on new forms probably.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, and we've talked about this in the past, about if LLMs are so great, where's the Cambrian explosion of code? Why aren't there more apps? Why aren't the app stores flooded? And my theory has always been we're having a Cambrian explosion of brittle code, of brittle software. And part of the reason we're not seeing like a massive flood of these being published is because you poke at it and it's like a little bit fragile, so you don't really want to publish it. You don't want to advertise it too much because it's not as solid as it could be. So the flood is happening, but it's a quiet flood.
I think it's happening internally too. I mean, I have a 2-person engineering team. It was just me until a couple of weeks ago. Now I have a new guy who's awesome, and it's me and him, and we each have like a little fleet of Claudes. But like, I think very quickly you realize the bottleneck is, well, how do we merge all this stuff? And so we're investing a lot in testing. I think earlier than I would with a 2-person team, like end-to-end integration testing and preview environments, like strict adding like, lots of unit test coverage, because I think initially you start spending tokens on the sort of generation side. You're like, oh wow, it's like really easy to generate code, and then I'm like, no, I need to like, to be honest, I'm trying to spend as many tokens as I can. Like I don't want to waste them, but like I'm trying to figure out, how can each engineer that we hire spend a lot of tokens, and very quickly it's like we need to shift more on the sort of verification side. We're not even really using tokens there yet, but we should probably be having like code reviews on the verification side. So I think it's partly why if you sort of solve one part of a value chain, but the bottleneck moves somewhere else, you haven't really gained. And I think that's what a lot of like larger organizations are seeing, that like they maybe tried GitHub Copilot or they tried something and like actually didn't see that many gains, because if you just have like code reviews pile up and you're not, you don't address that part of the bottleneck, there's not really much of a gain. So I think you're right on it. Like we're still early in trying to figure out like how do we build these new factories? Like we're mostly kind of doing the thing we were doing before with some
we're
tokens.
Still like in those. So in the 19th century, and please don't quote me on this, but there used to be these factories, and they'd have a donkey in the middle powering some kind of machine, and then when they got electricity, they just replaced the donkey.
Right.
But the factory was still exactly the same as before. And that's where we are today, and you're going, well, this isn't that much better. But when you change your process, so for example, instead of trying to burn as many tokens as possible, what if we're using tokens to build deterministic tools that did mutation testing, property-based testing, all that kind of analysis? You built debugging tools, inspection tools that were deterministic and thus cost 0 tokens after they were built. Now you've changed your process.
Totally.
I mean, there is going to be a class if you I have always gotten this as a product manager, but I can tell that larger engineering teams are making investments in infrastructure that protect them, and I think those teams are better positioned to get benefits from AI coding tools, because there is sort of the assumption that a rogue person could do something stupid, and you need a way to make sure that that doesn't hit 2 billion users. And making it easier for smaller teams to adopt stuff like that, I think, is a really rich place for people to be digging in. I'm not the person to do it because I don't know that world well enough, but I think that's really generative.
I think you actually are the person. If you think about it, basically, right now we've sort of set up for like, I have a 200-person team and I have dedicated QA people and dedicated design people, but you've got basically a one-man team. You're the person who needs these deterministic tools more, because there's nobody else to look over your shoulder.
Yeah, I like, Ade, your point. I mean, I have a little fake slide for you that kind of is getting into this, but like this idea of like you can use an LLM sort of at runtime, or you can use an LLM to generate deterministic things. You were talking about property testing. There's various other things that, and then you have something where you don't need tokens. It's deterministic. So I have a little like a fake slide. I was thinking. So I mean, I don't even know what this is, but I did a demo like a week ago, and instead of making slides, I was like, I'll just put this little microsite on our marketing page and have Claude Code just like make the slides for me. So this is like a little fake. It seems like slides, but it's actually just software. But what's fun is you can do stuff like this, like little like toggles and like animated stuff. But the thing I was going to bring up, I think like there's something here where I've been trying to think about guardrails as kind of like the opposite of vibe coding, where like it's ironic this is a presentation about guardrail coding, but I actually vibe coded this. I mean, I didn't look at the code for this presentation. Like the original definition of vibe coding is like, don't look at the code doesn't matter. Just sort of look at the result. But I think that if you think about like how do we constrain these agents, the problem I think that if they don't sort of understand our constraints, they go off and do crazy stuff. And I think where people start is kind of in this prompt space where I might start writing down in a cursor rules file or in an agents MD file more and more things I would like it to do, and it kind of works. It's better than nothing, but then sometimes it doesn't work. There's a limit to sort of how many they can handle. And I think sort of what you're suggesting nowadays, is like also, this to me is like using AI as an interpreter. Like every single time, read all these instructions, answer my question. And if you can use AI more as a compiler to say, hey, some of these instructions, not all of them, can be sort of encoded in our environment. Property testing or lint rules or unit tests or integration tests or sort of various ways that we can kind of check things deterministically. You get a lot of benefits. I mean, like if I can do it as a lint rule, it runs in 20 milliseconds. It costs me nothing. It's very, very cheap. So anyway, it's kind of I do like that spirit. And I think teams should think more about how do we sort of take some of the instructions that we care about and put them not in sort of longer and longer prompts, but somehow in some aspect of our testing environment or our coding environment or what is it?
I mean, the other thing you can optimize, instead of having the LLM spit out 20,000 lines of code then have a bunch of people and machines try to review all that code. What if you baked all of your linting, verification, testing inside the inner loop so that you as a
Totally.
human never see bad code from the LLM and then go, oh, no, 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 you don't do magic constants. Like, no,
Oh
no,
yeah.
no. The LLM should have that loop without you. You know, you should never have to tell the LLM, oh, no, 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 you should always use British English or those kinds of things. Like,
Yeah.
anytime
For
you have to
me,
tell the LLM something, go
totally.
on.
Yeah, I mean, I basically I have a command I just call PNPM check, and I try to load as many things in there as possible. And then in my whatever my agent's MD file, I say, hey, if you think you're done, go run PNPM check. And that, in the 'cause I don't want to see any code until all of this stuff is passed, because otherwise it's sort of like this sort of like very smart developer in some ways, but then also dumb in other ways. And they give you code, and it's like, dude, did you run the linter? It's like so I think you're right. I mean, I think you want to sort of load up as much strictness as you can and get it in the inner loop so that you never, because it's course correcting. It's sort of like learning from the failures in the environment, and then you'll never sort of see code, and then you're sort of incentivized then. How do I make that stricter and stricter? So I
It's
totally agree
bumper
with that.
bowling.
But also when you're doing runtime things, so I have this thing called Keyboardia. It's a multiplayer music synthesizer thing. The problem with it is multiplayer music means that debugging is a nightmare. But then I realized, wait, why is the LLM telling me to go test something or go, hey, do this and this and then see what it does? Okay, no, 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 no. You build a tool that can go and do that. So anytime I find myself manually debugging anything, I go, wait a minute, this is wrong. I didn't go to a restaurant and pay to cook for myself. I go back to the LLM and going, look, go figure out how to build a tool that will do what I was manually doing, store that in our source control, and anytime you run into any of these kinds of problems, I'm just going to paste an error, and you're going to use these tools to inspect using this process that I was doing manually. And so over time, more and more bugs with me going, oh, that's a bug, copy, paste. And you're like, yeah, it was this bug, fixed it.
It's cool.
I have gotten into skills. I've invested a lot in skills that allow my agent to call APIs as a version of this. Because where I struggle a lot with the moving things from the prompt space to the engineering space is that I am typically using it's like business logic that I'm checking for. And then I am blissfully unaware of what is happening from there on down. The strong DM guys are like, this is how we make serious software, but we don't read code and we don't review code. And I'm like, been there, guys. Welcome to 2025. But it's tough for me to actually know what levers I have to pull in the environment space and how to actually get it like linting, I guess, makes sense, but I've never had a linting bug be what sinks me.
Yeah.
It's how do I get that into the stuff that is actually what sinks me? So Matt, you've talked in the past about design systems. I actually think that's a really good one, is setting up rules that enforce usage of the design system is a great one, because it's a place where I can see in my app today, I'm like, why is that color blue in there? Okay, because I haven't set that up. But it's a different skill to think in that way.
Well, it sounds like with the browser, I agree that there's sort of different domains of sort of checks. Ade's talking about kind of property-based testing. That might be one sort of domain that if I could express, there's like some tool chain that does that. Okay, I could compile to that. Linters are sort of cheap, but all they really do is enforce kind of code-based rules. So you can do some things, like if you care about accessibility, some of that stuff can be verified as code rules. But the other stuff you need a browser. And so, some of the stuff that you've been doing, James, I think kind of more than me, honestly, kind of MCPs to browsers, I think is another way to kind of say, I want to be able to sort of express almost like, could I explain to a QA person what I would want to go check, and they would need a browser to go and actually look at it. It's almost like, don't start from the code, start more from a user perspective. So I think we're all kind of trying to find ways to first I have some ambiguous intent. Okay, how do I make it clearer? And then, then it's like, well, how do I actually go to the end and be like, how would I know if this was sort of correct, or, what if I can express it as what does success look like? Great. That's, then the model can go and actually sort of work in the loop until it's kind of done. But I think we need better ways to kind of express, I don't know what to call them, kind of the guardrails is what I call them, but kind of checks or tests.
It feels very test-driven development-y to me. I was never a test-driven developer, but when people talk to me about it, it does make sense. It's like when you can set up the things that have to be true, it does actually force you to articulate what you want to build.
So you could flip this around. So if you've ever had a custom suit made, And you go in and you're like, I want a suit, but you have no vocabulary, you know. And if you work with somebody who's actually good, they'll say, okay, you have no vocabulary. Part
Mm-hmm.
of my job is to educate you so you can make good choices. In the same
Mm-hmm.
way, if I've got a CSS bug, before it was this painful struggle. Now what I do is I ask the LLM, hey, explain with an annotated ASCII diagram what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll ask you questions like, well, why is that aligned with that? And they'll say, because this uses margin bottom and this uses padding top. And I'm like, oh, but what if I wanted this to be with this? And it would say, well, there's 3 ways. And I'll say, let's try this way. Whereas, and it's like, oh, good. And then I can, if I have things that I struggle with, I can ask the LLM, here's what I think is going on. Can you explain it back to me in a more structured way? And then have it give me an explanation. And then we have some language to manipulate the pieces of the explanation.
Totally. I mean, I think people should sort of engage in more back and forth where the LLM's kind of asking questions, because I also like your point about like I'm not a tailor, I don't know what to ask, but if I had an expert tailor, they would guide me through a process that would sort of reveal my preferences, and I would end up with a good suit. I mean, I think a lot of this is like in design too. Like if you know, a lot of people say, oh, these things don't have good taste. I mean, I actually think they have quite good taste, but you need to kind of prompt a little bit to get it out of them. So I think about if let's say you're working on like a marketing site, and you want to sort of develop a brand, a lot like typical like CEO of a startup doesn't know the words to ask to sort of go through that exercise. And so they would hire an agency that would like lead them through like a whole sort of set of questions and, exercise. And okay, then they'd come up with like a good brand. So you can ask an LLM to do that. And you can sort of say, hey, I want you to like interview me until there's enough, clarity to go and like make some explorations. It's or like if it's more of a coding thing, but before I say get to work, I'll often say, like what other information do you want to discuss before we start working? And it like I do that quite often before it gets to work, because it's just I think it sort of understands where the uncertainty is, and it wants to kind of reduce the uncertainty. Whereas if you say go, it's going to just go and like it'll fill in the details based on whatever it thinks is most likely. But I mean, I think there's tools even. I think Claude has some tools. I've never used it. I don't think it needs to be
Oh,
toolified, but just like let's do some Q&A before we decide, I think is kind of my pattern.
I mean, the other part of this is you said these tools have good taste. Whenever somebody tells me about taste as the ultimate differentiator, I always want to ask, do you, a human person, have good taste? How do you know? And part of the things about going to an established tailor person is that they have taste, they have understanding, and part of their job is to kind of explain to you that you have bad taste.
Mm-hmm.
Because you come in and go, I want this pink suit with glowing gold stripes, and they'll say, okay, why? What effect are you trying to make? And you're like, oh, well, it's a funeral. Like, oh, so what's the message you're trying to send? Oh, they really respected the dead person. Is gold and pink going to really achieve that? And they will help you understand that the appropriate thing is a black suit. And you come out of that session with better taste than you went in.
Mm-hmm.
And LLMs have access to a lot more knowledge than you do, so they can help you improve your taste.
I also think they can help you be more you. Like one of the things that I see with some of the most creative people that I know is that LLMs help them experience more of the world, which then becomes a part of them, which then comes back. Like one of Tyler Cohen's things to say is that it has taken him 60 some years to write whatever blog post he wrote this morning because he couldn't have written it 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a real thing in the world of LLMs. So like, Ade, when you were talking about your Space Invaders game, it would have never even occurred to me to ask about the history of Space Invaders game. I didn't know there was more than one. And that is a thing that only you can bring to that project. And this is where it starts to get like metaphysical. It's like we should be focused on building the things that only we can build. And it's a really great filtering mechanism, because if it's something that somebody else could be building, it's probably not the right thing to be building in the age of LLMs. But if it's something that only you could be building, like Matt, I think about your business, and I actually think that only like you and your wife are the one, you guys are the only ones that could build this specific business right now. And so this is exactly the right place for you to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like that LLMs are sort of an amplifier for what we already are in a way. I mean, I think often people used to say, oh, they just do like averages. And I think that was always sort of a misconception. I think that LLMs are trained on all sorts of different distributions of different types of human behavior, but you could prompt it to sort of act in a way that would have good taste, or you can prompt it to act in a way that has, poor taste, or any of these kind of things. And I think, the tailor that Ade is talking about, like, I don't think taste is like some innate thing. I think it's sort of born of experience as a tailor that sort of builds judgment by, making mistakes or learning from someone else who is, ahead of you. But I think, yeah, there's sort of like mirrors back to us a little bit that maybe we learn a little bit things from them. We also prompt them to sort of act in a certain way. It's quite bizarre what's happening. I think it's not like
But
any
I
other
think you
tools,
have
I think.
I think you have to not accept the defaults. Like the first time I
Totally.
was with a tailor and I basically said, these are uncomfortable. And he said, it doesn't have to be like that. I'm like, what? Oh, they don't have to be the default way? And that kind of mind-blowing experience of, wait, I can make these comfortable even if that's not the current fashion. And when you invoke an LLM and it gives you the default response, you can say, give me 5 other options for this. Give me 5 and make them extreme, and then a couple of middle ones. And suddenly, within a couple of iterations, you're getting surprising responses from this LLM.
Love that. I mean, that kind of ties this whole conversation back together for me. It's like, I think some people imagine going to like a tailor and just saying, give me a suit. And it's like, absolutely, sure, here's a suit. And you'd be a little bit disappointed with that result. And that's still, I think, a lot of how people are like kind of using it. It's like, well, maybe we should have a conversation before you get right into it. Or like, should I write a markdown spec about the suit I want? I don't know what to ask. That's like premature. So I do think it's, yeah, I mean, if you just sort of tell it to go, you're going to get kind of a default, slop looking thing. If you're doing UI, it's going to have purple indigo 500 buttons or gradients, or it's because you haven't sort of had a conversation about kind of what you want. You're using just the defaults. So I do think kind of prompt it away from the defaults to extremes. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but you have to show up and be open to its input or the things it can find on the web and bring to you. Because sometimes you'll see people, and not that I'm obsessed with suits, who have clearly spent a lot of money in a suit, but they've clearly not spent 30 seconds learning that suits should be comfortable. And you'll see them somewhere very fancy in a suit that clearly you can feel their discomfort in as they wear this thing around.
This is the menswear guy on Twitter. This is his thing. And he's like, this is obviously an uncomfortable suit. And then he shows you. And one of my favorite things about him is that he actually teaches you that really well-crafted clothing is a conversation that started a long time ago and is continuing. And then for many people, like myself included, I'm like, I'm oblivious to that conversation that's happening. But for the people that are part of that conversation, it's really useful and insightful.
But I also
I have one meta question for you that I've been waiting to ask. How do you find things? Because I would say you are the person most likely to introduce me to some cool AI coding thing that I have never heard of before, or that I assumed didn't exist, that I had only thought of sort of in the shower one time, and then you're like, oh, here is exe.dev, and I'm like, oh yeah, somebody's already built this. What is your diet? How do you stay up on things?
So there's the flippant answer, which is that I'm really good at search. But that hasn't been meaningful. That hasn't meant anything since about 1996, when I used to actually have a summer job searching the web for people. Nowadays, it's more about heterophily. So homophily is the birds of a feather flock together thing, where everybody you know is very much like you. Heterophily is the thing where you realize that everybody you know might seem like they're exactly like you, but everybody you know has a connection to some community that's not like you. So I would give the example that if you're at a gathering of Hell's Angels, but one of the guys actually happens to be an Anglican vicar, that person's going to bring you surprising insights. And if one of the other people in the team happens to be, I don't know, a professional footballer, they're bringing different insights. And so when you look at the room, you go, oh, it's a bunch of Hell's Angels. That's one lens you could look at them. Another lens is what all the different sort of aspects of these people, all the different facets of these people, can you bring that out? Can you use that to discover surprising new things? So then it becomes, here's a thing that's perfectly normal in the Python community, but I bring it into a conversation between, let's say, people who are doing Go, for instance. And in the Go community, oh, wow, this is a bold innovation you've got here. In the Python community, there's a 10-year-old idea that everybody knows. And if you do enough of that, you seem like you're always, bringing new stuff. But it's old somewhere else.
That's cool. I like this idea of old ideas. I forget, you probably know Ade more than me. Who's Brian Eno? There was those cards that were meant to sort of evoke creativity. There's add a constraint, remove a constraint. But one of them was like use an old idea, and I tend to draw on that one quite a bit. Like going back through computer science. But you're right that it's also like some ideas are old in one community and like totally novel in a new one, and there's probably some wisdom. And
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Eno's oblique strategies are pretty cool. But I think the one I really like is Nintendo's philosophy about lateral thinking with withered technology. Just because it's everybody else sees the same withered equipment, and then but then Nintendo comes along and says, "Imagine this: a games console with massively outdated technology, and we will sell millions of them."
It was great. I bought it.
I loved it. Yeah, I was a Nintendo guy above all.
The Wii, the Switch. Yeah, it was more appealing than the Xbox or the PlayStation, less powerful, but
yeah,
the constraints of the platform almost made the creativity of the games was like quite high.
Yeah, I find myself wanting things like smartphones to wither enough that Nintendo will show up in that space.
I would totally
buy
buy
a Nintendo smartphone. There are some people that are toying around with that. Yeah. But a Nintendo smartphone for sure. I haven't wanted a smartphone that badly since we all wanted Apple to make a phone. Like now I'm back to that. Anyway. All right. Anything else you guys got this week that you want to leave people with?
Super fun.
All right,
great to see you, Ade.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I think this has been great.
Yeah.
Love the experience, and I'd hope to come back at some point when I have a fancy studio like Matt.
I'm in a co-working space. This is not my home. There's one room in here called the podcast studio, which if it's available, I book for this chat. But it looks like way fancier than it should be.
Well, everybody needs to have some